It all started with what was supposed to be a simple life in the woods. I had bought a quiet little cabin away from the chaos of the city, hoping to live in peace. But that peace didn't last long. My property happened to fall under the reach of a strict homeowners association, the kind of hoe that believed rules mattered more than people. They hit me with a massive fine, $4,200, for things as petty as the color of my fence and the way I parked my truck. At first, I thought it was just another money grab, but soon I realized this hoe was willing to go much further than I ever imagined. I refused to pay. I stood my ground. And that's when the harassment began. Letters stuffed in my mailbox, phone calls at odd hours, even strangers creeping around my cabin at night. Every move they made felt like an attempt to push me out. But nothing compared to the night they sent someone pretending to be a police officer. He showed up flashing a fake badge, pounding on my door with threats that chilled me to the bone. What I didn't know at first was that this wasn't just intimidation, it was a setup. The hoe wanted to scare me into submission, but they didn't know something crucial. I wasn't alone in that cabin. By pure fate, 3 U.S. Marshals were inside that very night, working on an unrelated matter and using my place as a temporary safe house. The fake officer had no idea who he was walking into. The silence of the woods, the tense knock at the door, and the weight of everything that had led up to this moment all collided at once. And then, everything changed. The night had already felt strange even before that knock. The woods around my cabin usually gave me comfort, but lately they seemed to hold a heavier silence. Every crunch of branches outside made me wonder if the hoe had sent someone else to lurk around. I'd already caught one of their so-called inspectors snooping through my property a week earlier, pretending to check boundary lines. That was when I knew this was no longer about fines or rules. This was personal. The marshals inside my cabin weren't supposed to be part of my story at all. They had shown up quietly a few days earlier, explaining they needed a discreet place while working a case nearby. I agreed, thinking it would just be a temporary arrangement. I didn't ask too many questions, but I could feel the weight of whatever they were involved in. They were calm, disciplined, and watchful, like men who had seen more than they'd ever say out loud. And in a way, having them there gave me a sense of safety I hadn't felt in months. Meanwhile, the hoe wasn't letting up. Their board president, a man who carried himself like a sheriff of his own little empire, had made it clear that non-compliance wouldn't be tolerated. He sent letters claiming my cabin was bringing down property values and demanded that I either pay up or face serious consequences. It was laughable at first, until the threats began to sound less like legal jargon and more like warnings whispered in the dark. So when that knock came, loud and sharp against the wooden door, my stomach sank. I knew this wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a friendly visit. Whoever was outside was here for something far more dangerous, and the marshals in the room had already shifted their eyes toward the door. The air grew heavy, and I realized the night was about to take a turn I could never forget. The voice outside the cabin was firm, almost rehearsed. He called out my name, claimed he had an urgent matter, and ordered me to open the door. His tone carried that fake authority that only made my skin crawl. The badge he flashed through the window looked real enough at first glance, but something about the way he held it told me he wasn't who he said he was. The marshals didn't move right away, but I saw the subtle shift in their posture, like wolves recognizing another predator in their territory. Inside my head, everything raced. Why would an hoe send someone pretending to be law enforcement? What did they expect to gain from intimidating me like this? The fine was outrageous, but this went beyond money. It felt like they wanted to make an example out of me, to scare anyone else who dared to resist their grip. Meanwhile, the marshals had their own reasons to be cautious. They weren't just there to help me, they were already juggling a high-stakes operation in the area, one I wasn't fully privy to. But I could tell this unexpected visitor at my door now threatened to complicate everything they were working on. The tension wasn't just mine anymore, it was theirs too. As the knock grew louder, another subplot revealed itself. My nearest neighbor, an older man named Jack, had warned me months ago about crossing the hoe. He once said, "They don't just fine you, they break you down." At the time, I thought he was exaggerating, but the look in his eyes had carried a truth I ignored. Now his words echoed in my head, and I began to wonder just how deep this HOA's influence really went. The marshals exchanged a glance, silent but loaded with meaning. I stayed frozen, waiting. Outside, the fake officer's voice grew sharper. The line between a property dispute and something far darker was beginning to blur, and I wasn't sure how much longer the door between us would hold. The pounding on the door grew harder, rattling through the cabin like thunder. Every strike echoed off the wooden walls, each one more impatient than the last. The man outside was no longer trying to sound official. His voice had shifted into threats, sharp and desperate, as if he was running out of time. I could hear him muttering under his breath, something about settling this tonight. My pulse hammered in my ears, and for a moment it felt like the cabin itself was holding its breath. Inside, the marshals were already in motion. One moved quietly toward the back window, checking the tree line. Another kept his eyes fixed on the door, reading every movement and sound with a calm intensity that made me realize how serious this had become. The third stayed near me, whispering just enough to make it clear. I wasn't to move, speak, or react. They didn't want the man outside to know I wasn't alone. But I knew something he didn't. This cabin wasn't just walls and wood. It had history. I had reinforced parts of it over the years, added hidden spaces, even rigged quiet alarms after the first signs of harassment. The HOA thought I was some stubborn homeowner clinging to a piece of land, but the truth was I'd been preparing for the day they would push too far. The fake officer began circling the porch, his boots crunching against gravel as he tested the windows. I caught the shadow of a second figure slipping through the trees, confirming what I feared: he wasn't alone. This wasn't a bluff, and it wasn't just about a $4,200 fine anymore. Something larger was at play, and the HOA was willing to risk everything to get it done. The marshals tightened their positions. My chest grew heavier with each second. The line between silence and chaos was razor thin now, and I knew the next sound, the next move, would decide everything. The sound of footsteps outside suddenly stopped. For a moment, everything went eerily quiet, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but charged, like the pause before lightning splits the sky. I thought maybe the fake officer had backed off, but then the marshal by the window caught sight of something and gave a subtle hand signal. There wasn't just one extra figure in the trees. There were two. The HOA hadn't just sent a decoy with a badge. They had brought backup, and they were moving into position. That realization hit me harder than the knock ever could. This wasn't about scaring me anymore. They had planned this. It was organized, deliberate, and much bigger than a homeowner refusing to pay a fine. The HOA's board president wasn't just flexing his authority, he was orchestrating something that felt more like an ambush. Suddenly, Jack's warning about how they break you down didn't sound like paranoia. It sounded like experience. Inside the cabin, the marshals were no longer just observers in my story. Their calm had turned into quiet urgency. One whispered into a radio I hadn't noticed before, while another adjusted his stance by the door, watching for the slightest shift in shadow. The air was thick with anticipation, and every creak of the cabin floor seemed too loud, too dangerous. Then came the second twist. Through the thin glass of the front window, I caught sight of a vehicle pulling up without headlights. It wasn't marked, but I recognized the shape. It was the HOA board president's truck. He wasn't hiding in the shadows like the others. He was here in person, stepping out as if he had the final word. His presence changed everything. The pounding at the door resumed, harder and faster, almost frantic now. The marshals were locked in. My chest was tight, and I realized the stakes had gone far beyond my cabin. What was coming next wasn't just about me anymore. It was about exposing something much deeper than an HOA fine. The pounding on the door reached its peak when the marshals finally moved. In one swift motion, the door was flung open, not by me, but by them, and the fake officer on the porch froze in shock. His badge slipped slightly in his hand, the act falling apart the moment he realized who was standing in front of him. Behind the marshals, I could see the other shadows outside freeze as well, caught off guard by a presence they hadn't anticipated. The board president stood near his truck, arms crossed like he had come to watch the show. But when the marshals stepped out, his confident smirk faltered. One of them spoke firmly, identifying themselves with the kind of authority that couldn't be faked. The men in the tree line hesitated, unsure if they should run or fight, and in that hesitation, the entire scheme unraveled. The HOA had crossed a line they couldn't take back, and now they were face to face with federal law enforcement. For a moment, it felt like the storm had broken. The fake officer dropped his act. The president tried to backpedal with excuses about property disputes, and the marshals moved swiftly to take control of the situation. It was tense, chaotic, and strangely surreal. What had started as a fine over paint and parking had escalated into a showdown none of us could have predicted. But just when I thought it was over, the final twist revealed itself. As the marshals secured the scene, one of them quietly told me their ongoing case wasn't random at all. The HOA had been under investigation for months: extortion, harassment, even ties to organized schemes. My refusal to pay the $4,200 fine had unknowingly drawn them out into the open. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was realization. My cabin hadn't just survived the night. It had become the very place where the truth finally came to light. When the dust settled that night, the cabin no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a shield. The marshals stayed until the last of the men were taken away, their calm presence breaking the tension that had gripped every corner of the woods. The fake officer, the president, and the others who thought they could intimidate me into silence were all escorted off my property, their plans shattered by the very people they never expected to be there. The fine, the threats, the endless harassment, it had all led to this turning point. In the days that followed, the full picture became clearer. The HOA hadn't just been targeting me. They had a pattern of squeezing homeowners with unfair fines, then using intimidation to force payments. For years, neighbors like Jack had tried to fight back but were beaten down by fear and isolation. My refusal to bend and the marshals' unexpected presence had cracked the pattern wide open. It turned out my little cabin had been sitting at the center of something much bigger than me. Jack came by a few days later, shaking his head with relief. "Told you they'd pushed too far," he said with a small smile. For the first time, I didn't just feel like the stubborn neighbor holding his ground. I felt like part of a community that was finally free from the grip of a corrupt HOA. Looking back, it's almost surreal. A $4,200 fine meant to break me ended up exposing an entire network of intimidation and greed. And while I never asked for this fight, I learned that sometimes standing your ground does more than protect your home. It can change the story for everyone around you. In the quiet of the woods now, peace finally feels real again.